Tensions are rising in one of the most hotly contested regions on the planet, the South China Sea.
China's Coast Guard fired water cannons at Philippine ship.
The Philippines calls it piracy.
They're not just pirates, they are typical bullies.
Threatening the Philippine Navy officer with an axe.
They are trying to justify this aggressive, unlawful, and barbaric actions.
China is the most sophisticated gray zone operator the world has ever seen.
I don't think the Philippines have the capability to play this kind of game.
Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has argued targeting its seas is an attack on the nation's soul.
We cannot allow anyone to detach it.
In 2014, China started carrying out its plan to attack 5 countries at once. It began building islands, military islands, right here in the South China Sea, inside the borders of other countries. Since then, the bullying hasn't stopped. And now China takes it even further by resorting to tactics just short of war. Scenes like this have become way too common. Chinese forces are now openly using military-grade lasers, ramming vessels, and even sinking them. And the artificial islands are only making things worse. Each one is armed with anti-aircraft guns, missile systems, runways, radar, and weapon depots. In just 2 years, China built not 1, not 2, but 7 of these islands inside of other countries' borders without their permission. To back up this land grab, China even drew its own map, a U-shaped 9-dash line that claims nearly 90% of the South China Sea. The problem is, that line cuts right through other countries' zones, like the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and a bunch more. It's reasons like these why U.S. Army experts believe that these islands, right here in the South China Sea, have the highest chance of instigating World War III. You see, the South China Sea is one of the most valuable and contested regions on the planet. It roughly handles a third of global maritime trade. That's over $3 trillion worth of goods every year. So if this place turns into a war zone, or falls under one nation's strict control, the ripple effects on global trade and energy supplies would be devastating. But that's just the start. Beneath these waters lies an estimated 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. To put that into perspective, that's like finding another Kuwait's worth of oil and almost a Qatar's worth of gas just sitting there, waiting to be extracted. For any energy-hungry nation in Asia, well, this is gold. And China knows it. So do Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, who've all been racing to claim a piece. Moreover, the sea is also one of the richest ecosystems on the planet, home to nearly a third of all marine life. And if all this wasn't reason enough, the South China Sea connects East Asia to the Middle East and Africa. It's the main highway between 2 oceans, the Indian and the Pacific. Whoever controls these waters controls the flow of fuel, food, and supplies between some of the world's biggest economies. Now, that might sound like an exaggeration, but it really isn't. The problem for China is that international law exists, and in theory, everyone is supposed to follow it. According to the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, a country controls 12 nautical miles from its coastline. That's its sovereign territory. Beyond that, it gets a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, or EEZ. You can fish there, build platforms, drill for oil, but you don't own it outright. That's the rule. It's how countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Brunei legally mark their claims in the South China Sea. China signed that agreement too. But when it came to this region, it decided to play by its own rules and brought in the infamous 9-dash line. The original line was drawn by China's nationalist government back in the 1940s. It basically claimed nearly 90% of the entire South China Sea as historically Chinese. It sliced right through the waters of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and went as far as 1,500 kilometers south of China's mainland. Nobody accepts it. Not the UN, not international courts, not China's neighbors. But that hasn't stopped Beijing from printing it on passports, maps, and official documents. In 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague invalidated this 9-dash line claim, ruling that China's so-called historic rights had no legal basis under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. That was a huge win on paper for the Philippines, who brought the case, and a rebuke to Beijing. But in reality, China just shrugged and kept on keeping on. It dismissed the ruling outright and warned its neighbors not to get any ideas. They bully anyone who opposes China's rules. They silence countries and critics. You see, the CCP doesn't like getting criticized, and that's why the communist government spends $30 billion every year to censor dissent inside the country. The CCP has also started investing heavily in pushing propaganda here on YouTube. Using AI and bots, the CCP promotes pro-China content and suppresses anti-CCP content on this platform. This is why I really mean it when I say that without your likes, our videos would not get any views. So if you guys can take a quick second and hit that like button and subscribe below, it would help us out tremendously. So the Hague ruling was definitely bad news for the CCP. But they had already seen this coming. They knew that under international law, to claim an EEZ, you need land, actual land, not just a map line. So, in 2014, China went on a land reclamation spree. It took tiny reefs and rocks in the Spratly Islands, some just barely above water at high tide, and started piling sand and cement on them to create artificial islands. Whole fleets of dredgers sucked up sand from the seafloor and pumped it onto the reefs, killing the coral but creating military outposts out of nothing. In total, China built around 3,200 acres of new land on 7 reefs by 2017. To get a sense of what they actually built, Fiery Cross Reef used to be a shallow piece of land, just a ring of coral barely above the water. Now, it's a military base with a 3-kilometer runway, radar domes, missile shelters, and housing for who knows how many troops. The same story at Mischief Reef, which, by the way, sits inside the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. It now has ports, barracks, and enough facilities to support full-on military operations. China didn't just claim the sea. It brought concrete and airstrips and planted anchors of its navy right in the middle of disputed waters. These islands are over 700 miles away from the Chinese mainland, but it's just a stone's throw away from the coasts of Vietnam and the Philippines. Now, officially, China says these are just civilian facilities, weather stations, rescue outposts, research hubs. But nobody's buying it. In 2015, Xi Jinping stood next to Obama in the White House Rose Garden and said, "We do not intend to militarize the Spratlys." Well, that didn't age well. Within a year or two, satellite images showed surface-to-air missile systems, long-range radars, and jet fighter hangars popping up. By 2018, U.S. surveillance confirmed what everyone had already suspected. 3 of those reefs had been fully militarized. Combine that with China's existing military presence in the Paracel Islands up north, and you've got a triangle of power that covers nearly the entire South China Sea. For years, these islands gave China the upper hand. They were used to intimidate neighbors, chase off fishing boats, block supply runs, and flex on rival navies. But there's one thing Beijing didn't plan for: physics. These islands weren't built on solid rock. They're just piles of sand dumped on fragile coral reefs. And that means they shift, they crack. Some parts are already sinking. That's why Chinese dredgers haven't gone away. They still show up from time to time, either to patch things up or to rebuild what's eroding. And now, they're getting desperate. In 2024, reports came out that Chinese marine engineers are injecting cement slurry deep into the island's base to keep the sand from collapsing. But that doesn't mean they stopped. Western analysts leaked satellite images from late 2022 and 2023 that showed new land formations at unoccupied reefs in the Spratlys. One name that stood out was Eldad Reef, also called Anda Reef. A reef that used to disappear at high tide suddenly had piles of dredged sand and signs of human activity. All evidence pointed to China, but of course, they denied it and called it fake news. But the Philippines? They weren't buying it. Their officials said they were seriously concerned and launched an investigation. Vietnam wasn't far behind. Whether Eldad becomes the next Mischief Reef or not, the point is, China might not be done. 7 military outposts already exist, but they might be looking to fill more of the gaps in radar coverage, missile range, and surveillance zones. And while all of that is happening, other countries are trying to do the same, especially Vietnam, which has added over 280 hectares of new land by reclaiming land from the sea, primarily in the Spratly Islands. But it may be too late now. China had years of head start in this island-building game. Now the rest are just trying to hold their ground, or at least not get pushed out completely. Other nations were too late to figure out that militarizing islands is one way to project power. It's a way to use what's called gray zone tactics. Tactics that fall below the level of open conflict but still cause damage. That's where China's maritime militia comes in, often nicknamed the Little Blue Men. Technically, they're fishing boats, but in reality, they aren't, because they're state-sponsored. All they do is swarm and linger around disputed reefs for weeks, flying Chinese flags, pretending to fish, even when satellite data shows they're not fishing at all. They block foreign ships, intimidate smaller boats, shadow oil rigs, and act as China's first line of presence. And because they're quote-unquote civilians, they create a trap. If the Philippine Navy were to fire on them, China could spin it as an unprovoked attack on innocent fishermen. A good example of this is the Whitsun Reef. Back in early 2021, over 200 Chinese boats showed up inside the Philippines' EEZ. all packed in tight, anchored side by side. They didn't move. When questioned, China claimed they were just sheltering from bad weather. But satellite images showed clear skies, just a swarm of boats sitting there for weeks. Eventually they left, but everyone in the region understood the message, that China can flood any reef it wants, anytime it wants, and because they're just fishing boats, responding with force becomes too risky. Push too hard, and suddenly you're at war with China. The same thing happened again in 2023, this time at Razul Reef and Escada Shoal, again within the Philippines waters. Dozens of Chinese fishing boats showed up, lingered for days, then left. But after they were gone, Filipino divers went down to check the area. What they found was shocking. Crushed corals, scraped seabeds, and entire patches of marine life wiped out. The Philippine Coast Guard said it looked like the reef had been blasted or harvested, maybe to prepare it for future land reclamation, or to extract rare coral and clams. China, as usual, denied everything. But the patterns keep repeating. Then there's the China Coast Guard, the CCG, which at this point is basically a navy in disguise. Over the past few years, they've added massive new ships, some the size of destroyers. In 2021, Beijing passed a new law, giving its Coast Guard the green light to use weapons in any waters China claims. That sent a chill across Southeast Asia, because now, if China decides you're trespassing, even in waters that aren't legally theirs, they've given themselves permission to open fire. And at the rate they're going, it's only a matter of time before China starts claiming all of Asia, the Pacific, your backyard, my phone, and your grandmother's front porch. The CCG has been hyperactive ever since. And most of the videos you see, Chinese ships blocking, blasting, or ramming others out at sea, yeah, chances are those are CCG ships doing the dirty work. So how are other countries fighting back? Well, it's a complicated scenario. Each of the five seems to have their own strategy. None of them want war, but none of them are staying silent either. So bigger powers like the US, Japan, Australia, and India have stepped in. Because, as I said earlier, a Chinese-controlled South China Sea doesn't just affect Southeast Asia. It affects everyone. The Philippines has been the most vocal, especially after winning that 2016 arbitration case at The Hague. Under President Duterte, Manila tried appeasement. They downplayed the ruling, hoping for Chinese investments and smoother ties. But China kept creeping in anyway, by harassing fishermen and spraying Coast Guard ships with water cannons. Eventually, public frustration kept building up. When Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. came to power, things changed. The Philippines filed dozens of diplomatic protests, documented every Chinese move, and started sending journalists on board patrol boats. That's how the laser incident and the ramming footage came out. Marcos also strengthened the US alliance, granting access to 4 more military bases under the EDCA agreement. Some of those bases are in Palawan, and directly facing the South China Sea is a clear message to Beijing. And Washington hasn't held back either. In 2023, US officials made it pretty clear that if China attacks a Philippines public vessel, including the Coast Guard, it would trigger the Mutual Defense Treaty. After the October ramming incident, President Biden called the US commitment to the Philippines ironclad. The US even updated its policy to include gray zone attacks, like lasers or water cannons, not just open war. At the same time, joint military drills got bigger. Balikatan 2023 was the largest ever, with live-fire excursions off Luzon. And now Manila is planning joint patrols with the US, Japan, and Australia. Even the Philippine Navy and Coast Guard are getting better gear. Japan gave patrol vessels, India is selling BrahMos missiles, and Australia is joining maritime coordination. So ironically, China's pressure has started building the very coalition it was trying to avoid. Then there's Vietnam, a country with a long, bloody history of conflict with China. From ancient invasions to the 1979 border war and the loss of the Paracels in 1974, the wounds are still open. Vietnam doesn't have a defense treaty with the US, but it doesn't need one to stand its ground. Yet Hanoi has expanded ties with Russia, India, and even the US. They've upgraded their presence in the Spratlys, adding around 280 hectares of new land to the reefs they already hold. There's talk of airstrips coming next, possibly on Spratly Island or Nam Yit. Vietnam has also deployed mobile rocket systems along its coast, aimed right at China's artificial islands if things ever turn hot. They've shown before that they're willing to fight. In 1988, Vietnamese troops, completely outgunned, tried to hold Johnson South Reef. China won that battle, but Vietnam still marks the anniversary each year. Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei are a bit on the quieter side. They've all pushed back in their own ways, through protests, patrols, or quiet diplomacy, but none of them want to escalate things publicly. Still, their silence shouldn't be mistaken for weakness. Each one has drawn its own line, and they're watching closely. Now, the United States has no claim in the South China Sea, and yet it's the main deterrent against China. The POTUS has made it clear again and again that freedom of navigation in the South China Sea is a national interest. which is why US warships and aircraft regularly patrol the area to enforce that point. They conduct what's called Freedom of Navigation Operations, or FONOPs, sailing within 12 nautical miles of contested reefs to challenge China's so-called excessive maritime claims. Every time a US destroyer passes near Mischief Reef or through the Paracels, Beijing fumes. They call it illegal, but Washington always replies the same way. We'll sail wherever international law allows us. And that cat-and-mouse game has already led to some close calls. In 2018, a Chinese destroyer cut across the bow of the USS Decatur, nearly colliding. Then again, in June 2023, a Chinese warship came within 150 yards of the USS Chonghun as it transited the Taiwan Strait with a Canadian frigate. Before that, Chinese radio told the Americans to mind your own business. The US Navy called it what it was, an unsafe maneuver. And over the years, China has been getting bolder and bolder. But the US isn't alone anymore. Japan, which relies heavily on the sea lanes for fuel imports, has been stepping up to sending ships for joint drills. And in 2023, even considering joint patrols with the Philippines. They've also donated patrol boats to both Manila and Hanoi to boost regional coast guards. Australia has conducted drills with the US and the Philippines. In 2023, Australian warships sailed with Filipino vessels inside the Philippines EEZ, and of course were shadowed by Chinese ships. One Chinese media outlet even called Australia a potential adversary. That's how serious things have gotten. India, though not a direct South China Sea player, also has skin in the game. It's sold BrahMos missiles to the Philippines, trained Vietnamese naval forces, and occasionally sends ships through the area for goodwill missions. In 2020, even some Indian think tanks suggested India join joint patrols with the US, Japan, and Australia, the Quad. New Delhi isn't there yet, but it's watching closely. Europe hasn't stayed out either. The UK sent the HMS Queen Elizabeth carrier group through the region in 2021. France and Australia have done joint sails. Even Palau, a small Pacific island, signed an agreement letting the US Coast Guard enforce laws in its waters, mostly to stop illegal Chinese fishing. It's really not just a regional issue anymore, it's global. As of 2024, the island building, the militias, the legal battles, the constant confrontations have turned the South China Sea into one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. One wrong move, one overconfident captain, one snap decision, and everything could blow up into World War III.